Yo, what up everyone out there in YouTube land? Grim's on the beat here. So, recently I got a request from a new subscriber to do a video on how to connect and use a mixing board with Logic Pro. Now, I'm assuming he or she was talking about an analog mixing board, not a control surface. To the person that made the request, if you were talking about a control surface or a MIDI control surface, please let me know in the comments of this video, and I will do a follow-up video to this as soon as possible. Okay, so unfortunately, I'm probably not going to be much help here because connecting a mixing board depends on a few things, one of them being the mixing board itself. Different mixing boards have different inputs and outputs, different number of inputs and outputs. So it's not always one size fits all, so to speak. Like if you have, say, a cheap 12-channel analog mixing board compared to one of the really big, expensive, like 64-channel analog mixing boards, like, it's gonna be vastly different. Another factor in how you connect it is going to be, what are you planning on using it for? You're looking to use it for tracking? Are you looking to use it for mixing? Like, are you trying to route all the tracks in your DAW into the mixing board and do your final mix on that, and then route the stereo mix from the analog mixing board back into Logic? Or are you trying to print each individual channel from the board back into your DAW and do your final mix in the DAW? See, it depends on what you're trying to do. Another factor is your audio interface. Depending on your audio interface, how many inputs and outputs it has, that might limit what you can do. Even if you have like a mixing board that has like 24 channels or more. It's usually something like 24 channels or more. Each channel will have its own output. So you can route audio in and out of that channel, and then there will be another section for the master fader that has inputs and outputs as well. So you can output the whole stereo mix of everything going into the mixer. So it all depends. Like if you got something like 14 or 16 channels and under, typically, from what I've seen, those don't really have an output for each channel. You got outputs for the master fader and then some monitor outputs that also go through the master fader. So basically you can get audio into each of the channels using an XLR cable through the mic input on each channel, or the 1/4 inch or line in input, and then just output the stereo mix back into your DAW and print that onto a stereo file. Like I said, ones that are like mixing boards that are like 24 channels or and up, a lot of times will have an output for each individual channel. So if you want to, say, run each individual track in your session into the mixer and get your mix done on the analog mixing board, then probably gonna want to set the output on the track to a physical output on your interface, each track a separate physical output on your interface, and then connect that output to the input of the channel strip of the mixing board, and then the output for that channel into one of the inputs on your interface. If you want to print each one back. However, if you just want to print a stereo mix back, then you just connect the stereo outputs on the master fader into a pair of inputs on your interface, and then set that like you would an input on an audio track in whatever DAW you're using. In this case, the person asking is using Logic. So it's not always one way to do it. There's multiple ways to get it done. You know, and connecting an analog mixing board can get expensive because you need an interface that has, like I said, an interface that has enough inputs and outputs for however you're trying to connect it. A lot of times you're probably going to need to expand that interface with an additional unit using digital inputs and outputs so you can get everything connected. And I'm not even going to go in to like the really big ones like SSLs and Neves, because those, oh boy, they are complex because there's so many different routing options on those. It can get complicated. Sorry I couldn't be more help. My best advice would be take a look at all the inputs of the mixing board you want to use with Logic. Look at the inputs. I recommend connecting the outputs from your audio interface. If you have an audio interface with enough outputs and inputs, then connect the outputs into a 1/4 inch line in on the channel strip of the mixing board. And then if the mixing board has an output for each channel, assuming that you want to print each channel back into Logic, look on the back, see if each channel has an output, and then connect that output into one of the inputs on your interface. If you're just trying to do the mix on the mixing board and then export the stereo file, or print the stereo file, my bad, into Logic, then just connect the master fader. It's really a bit of a headache. I couldn't go into more detail without knowing what type of mixer it is and without seeing pictures of all of the inputs and outputs available on the mixer as well as knowing what type of interface you have and the amount of inputs and outputs available on your audio interface. This video isn't of any help. I apologize. My next best advice would be experiment. Try hooking outputs to inputs, inputs to outputs, and see if you can get it working the way you want it to work just by trial and error. All right, have a good day, everyone.